Ryan Cole had never considered himself a man drawn to confrontation or spectacle. His entire adult life had been carefully constructed around the principles of quiet work, self-reliance, and personal boundaries. After years of saving, moving from cramped apartments and noisy shared houses, he finally managed to purchase a small but well-built home on the edge of a suburban development. It wasn't luxurious, but it had the kind of stability and silence that he valued more than anything. The house stood on a corner lot with wide windows and heavy oak doors, and in the evenings Ryan liked nothing more than sitting in his living room with the blinds slightly drawn, watching the shifting light fall across the furniture he had selected. Piece by piece, his work as a freelance designer often meant long stretches of isolation, but he preferred that to offices and endless chatter. The house became not just a financial investment, but a place that absorbed his rhythms, his late-night bursts of creativity, his quiet weekend mornings filled with coffee and books, the place where he could finally breathe without anyone's oversight. That is why the smallest disturbance in such a carefully arranged life struck him like a thunderclap. It happened on a Tuesday night when the day had been consumed with deadlines and screen fatigue, and he had retreated to his bedroom earlier than usual. As he reached up to pull the curtains closed, his eyes caught a faint glimmer, something that looked like a pinprick of red light reflecting against the fabric. At first, he thought it must be from an outside source, a car's taillights bouncing through the street, or perhaps the reflection from his own modem across the hall. But the light was steady, unwavering, and positioned exactly where it should not have been, right at the edge of the curtain rod, embedded so cleanly that he almost missed it. He leaned closer, frowning, and only then did the shape reveal itself. A tiny, circular lens, no wider than a button, aimed directly into his room. Ryan froze in place, his hand still clutching the curtain. For several moments he simply stared, as though by sheer disbelief he could will it into being something harmless, some trick of his overtired brain. But the more he examined it, the more the reality pressed in. The object was deliberate, manufactured, installed. Someone had placed a miniature camera in his bedroom, and it had been there long enough that he never noticed until now. His stomach dropped with a sudden wave of nausea, and he felt the air in the room shift, as if the walls themselves were watching him. He stepped back, pulling the curtain shut with a jerk, his heart hammering so loudly it drowned out the hum of the air conditioner. That night he barely slept. Every creak of the house sounded amplified. Every shadow on the ceiling seemed suspicious. Lying awake, Ryan replayed his routines in his mind, horrified at the thought of what had already been recorded. He lived alone. No one entered this space but him, yet now that assumption felt shattered. By morning, fatigue combined with a cold determination to confront what he had discovered. He retrieved a flashlight, climbed onto a chair, and pried the small device from its hiding place. The lens stared back at him as he turned it over in his hands, its metallic shell engraved with faint numbers he didn't recognize. It was real, undeniable, and designed to blend so seamlessly into the architecture that he wondered how many others were hidden just beyond his line of sight. Ryan's home had always represented sanctuary, a buffer against the world's intrusions, but holding that tiny camera made him realize the sanctuary had already been breached. The sense of violation was deeper than anger. It felt as though someone had taken a knife to the very fabric of his privacy. Whoever had placed this device had not merely wanted to watch, they had intended to control. As he stood in his bedroom, the weight of the discovery pressing into his chest, Ryan understood with a sudden clarity that the life he had built, the one defined by choice and solitude, had just shifted into a different kind of existence. He was no longer only living in his house. He was being observed inside it. The morning after discovering the first camera, Ryan moved through his house as though he were trespassing on his own property. Each step measured, each glance nervous, his eyes searching the familiar corners for signs of intrusion he had never thought to question before. Coffee boiled in the kitchen, but he barely touched it, his mind too consumed by the idea that if one lens had been hidden so carefully, others might be buried in plain sight. With a growing sense of dread, he fetched a small screwdriver set from his desk and began a methodical inspection, starting in the living room. He unscrewed the plastic casing of a smoke detector and almost dropped it when the cover came free, revealing not wires but a second tiny camera with the same metallic housing, its lens glinting at him like an unblinking eye. The realization that someone had gone so far as to dismantle and rebuild safety equipment to conceal surveillance filled him with a raw fury. He pulled it out and tossed it onto the table beside the first device, his hands trembling. The devices were too similar to be improvised or amateur. This was planned with precision, with access, with authority. By the time he reached the kitchen, he no longer wanted to search, but he forced himself. His fingers traced the edges of the vent above the stove, pried loose the thin metal grill, and once again he saw the reflection of glass hidden among the shadows. Another camera. He stopped counting after 4, each one hidden in a place so ordinary that it felt like a direct assault on his sense of perception. The more he found, the stronger the suspicion grew that this was not the work of a random intruder or burglar. No ordinary thief would install an array of hidden lenses and then leave without taking a thing. Whoever had done this wanted to monitor, not to steal. They wanted presence without visibility, control without confrontation. When the technician he hastily called later that afternoon confirmed his findings, Ryan hoped for at least a reaction of surprise, some acknowledgement that this was extraordinary. But the man, older, with grease on his hands and a permanent squint from years of labor, only muttered a low curse and leaned closer to inspect one of the devices. "These aren't cheap knockoffs," he said quietly, as though careful not to be overheard. "These are registered inventory. Serial numbers here, see? Someone filed these into a system, I can almost guarantee it." He scribbled the numbers into his notepad and checked them against a small online registry accessible from his tablet. What appeared on the screen made Ryan's skin prickle. The devices were listed under the property of Hearthwood Community Association Security Initiative, a name that, though sterile, he recognized immediately as the official title of his homeowners. Association. Ryan stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. He had been aware of the HOA's presence in his neighborhood, of course. Mailers left in his box about landscaping rules, reminders about trash bins, notices about community events he never attended. But he had always considered them a nuisance at worst, a background hum of bureaucracy that he could ignore as long as he paid his quarterly dues. Now that same association's name was carved into the surveillance equipment hidden in his bedroom, his kitchen, his living room. The line between oversight and violation had been obliterated. When he asked the technician if this was some mistake, the man shook his head slowly. "You don't just print serials like this. They're logged in municipal procurement records. Someone ordered them. Someone installed them. And they're not cheap." This was deliberate. It was with this knowledge that Ryan marched to the small nondescript HOA office tucked between a pharmacy and a nail salon at the edge of the development. The building's blandness felt like a disguise, a mask hiding something rotten. He pushed through the glass door and announced himself to the receptionist, a woman who greeted him with a practiced, faintly irritated smile. He explained what he had found, laid the devices on the counter, and demanded an explanation. For several minutes, she kept her expression neutral, typing on her keyboard with slow deliberation, before disappearing into a back room. When she returned, she was accompanied by Linda Faulkner, the HOA president, a woman Ryan had only ever seen in passing at community meetings he had intentionally avoided. Linda carried herself with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Her beige blazer, pearl necklace, and carefully styled hair all seemed part of the same calculated presentation. "Mr. Cole," she said warmly, as though welcoming him to a social gathering rather than facing accusations of trespass, "I hear you found some of our equipment." Ryan's skin prickled at the casual phrasing. "Our equipment?" he asked sharply. Linda's smile did not waver. "Yes, part of the Home Safety Pilot Program. You should have received the paperwork when you purchased your home. It's a voluntary initiative designed to ensure resident security. These devices are standard in several properties, though most people are appreciative of the extra oversight. Ryan felt his voice rising despite himself. Voluntary? I never agreed to anything. I didn't even know this program existed until last night when I discovered cameras in my bedroom. For a moment, her eyes flickered, the smile faltering, but she recovered quickly, sliding a folder from the receptionist's desk and opening it to reveal a printed form. She turned it toward him, and there, scrawled at the bottom, was his name, his address, and what looked like his signature beneath a clause labeled Consent for Surveillance under Community Security Initiative. The air seemed to thin around him as he stared at the page. The signature was a crude imitation of his handwriting, close enough to pass a casual glance, but to him the forgery was obvious. "That isn't mine," he said, his voice low now, edged with cold certainty. Linda tilted her head sympathetically as though speaking to a child who didn't understand the rules. "Mr. Cole, these forms are filed and notarized. If you're concerned about the details, you're welcome to consult legal counsel, but I assure you everything has been processed according to procedure." Ryan felt a rush of helpless rage, the kind that gnawed at his chest because every word she spoke was cloaked in the protection of formality, paper, and signatures. It didn't matter that the signature wasn't his, because the association had already created an entire bureaucratic structure to shield themselves from accountability. When he demanded the original copy, Linda only smiled again, this time with a shade of menace. "You'll need to file a request through our compliance department. We'll get back to you in 6 to 8 weeks. In the meantime, I suggest you try to appreciate the security we're providing. Not everyone values privacy above safety, you know." He left the office with the forged document burned into his memory, the polished calm of Linda's demeanor haunting him. It was no longer a question of whether his privacy had been violated. It had been erased, overwritten by the very system meant to manage his community. The association had not only broken into his home under the guise of protection, they had created the illusion that he had asked them to. And somewhere in that tangle of signatures and bylaws, Ryan understood with grim clarity, lay the justification they believed would keep them untouchable. When Ryan returned home from the HOA office, carrying with him the weight of Linda Faulkner's carefully polished indifference, he felt the house had already transformed into something unrecognizable, as if the walls themselves mocked his former sense of ownership. He had always thought of this place as the one corner of the world that belonged entirely to him. But now every door frame, every outlet, every ceiling fixture suggested hidden eyes, and with each glance he wondered how long the recording stretched back and how many strangers had already watched him eat, sleep, and work without his knowledge. He gathered the devices he had removed and set them on the table in the living room like evidence laid out for trial. Yet staring at them only deepened the sense that the trial would never happen because the very institution responsible had already forged the documents to justify itself. That night he did not even attempt to sleep in his bedroom. Instead, sitting on the couch in the half-dark, the television muted, the silence punctuated only by the occasional groan of the house as though it, too, were restless. The next morning he decided passivity would only tighten the noose around him. He went online, purchasing a set of small counter-surveillance cameras of his own, along with motion sensors and a wireless monitoring hub, devices not unlike the ones that had been turned against him. If the HOA believed they could manipulate the narrative by pretending he had consented, then he would shift the balance by gathering proof of what they were really doing. It took him nearly an entire day to wire the house in secret, setting cameras high in corners, disguised among bookshelves, or tucked against the molding of windows where no one would think to look. His hands shook as he screwed the last one into place, not out of fear of technology, but from the bitter realization that he was defending his own house as though it were hostile territory. It did not take long for the payoff to come. On the third night after installation, just past 2 in the morning, the motion sensor triggered an alert that jolted Ryan from uneasy sleep on the couch. He rubbed his eyes, heart pounding, and opened the monitoring app on his laptop. The grainy feed from the kitchen camera flickered to life, showing 2 silhouettes moving deliberately through the space. They were not burglars. Their movements were too methodical. Their flashlights dimmed to narrow beams, their clothing dark but not ragged. One of them wore a vest with reflective strips faintly visible, the kind issued by security contractors, and on the back of it Ryan could make out the words HOA Security. His breath caught in his throat as he leaned closer to the screen. The men did not ransack, did not search for valuables, did not even glance at the drawers. Instead, they went straight to the ceiling vent where Ryan had already discovered and removed a device. One of them pulled a replacement from his bag, while the other held the flashlight steady. The precision of their work was chilling. They were reinstalling surveillance inside his home as though it were routine maintenance, as though his house belonged not to him, but to them. He captured the recording, duplicating it onto a separate hard drive, knowing this was the evidence he needed. Yet the very act of watching them operate filled him with a terror far sharper than anger. They moved with confidence, certain of their authority, certain that no one would dare challenge them. For nearly an hour they worked their way through the house, stopping at each location Ryan had stripped bare, replacing every camera he had dismantled, sometimes whispering to each other in low tones that the microphones barely picked up. At one point, one of them chuckled and muttered, "This one pulls them out faster than most. Bet Faulkner won't like that," to which the other replied with a dismissive grunt. Their casual familiarity with his resistance chilled him as much as their intrusion. It suggested they had done this many times before, with other residents, each one dismissed as a paranoid or troublemaker until the system smothered their protest. When they finally exited through the back door, locking it again with his own latch as though nothing had happened, Ryan sat frozen before the screen, fists clenched, sweat dripping down his temples despite the cool air of the room. He did not sleep after that. At dawn, he walked the perimeter of his house, staring at the quiet neighborhood around him. The trimmed hedges, the rows of identical homes, each one a potential prison of hidden lenses. People walked their dogs, jogged past with headphones, carried coffee cups on their way to work, and none of them looked as though they knew they were being watched. Ryan wondered how many had signed papers unknowingly, or how many signatures had been forged like his. How many houses contained the same silent intrusions? The thought that his neighbors might be aware and complicit, or worse, completely oblivious, left him with the nauseating sense that the world he lived in had shifted into something unrecognizable. That evening, after nearly 24 hours of sleepless vigilance, Ryan compiled the footage into a secure file, labeling each segment, preparing it as though he were already building a case. He considered contacting the police, but imagined Linda's smug smile as she handed over the forged consent form, the officers shrugging and telling him it was a civil matter. Instead, he began to draft a different kind of plan, one not dependent on institutions that had already failed him. If the HOA insisted on watching him, he would turn their own system against them. He began researching ways to intercept the signals, to reprogram the cameras so that they no longer reported his life but instead funneled information outward in the opposite direction. The more he read, the more his exhaustion hardened into resolve. If they had made him a subject, he would make them subjects too. For now, however, the raw fact remained. 2 men had walked into his home at night, under the authority of an organization meant to serve the community, and had done so without hesitation, without permission, and without fear of consequence. That knowledge sat inside him like a poison, burning through every ordinary routine, transforming each hour into a battle of endurance. The first escalation had already happened. The HOA had crossed the line from bureaucratic manipulation into physical trespass, and Ryan understood there was no going back. They had declared ownership of his walls, his ceilings, his air, And with that realization came the unshakable conviction that the only way forward was to confront them, not by pleading innocence, but by exposing their hunger for control in a way they could not dismiss or rewrite. Ryan had spent most of his life in front of screens, immersed in the subtleties of design and the quiet discipline of digital precision, and though he had never been the type to tinker with hardware or dabble in electronics beyond what his profession required, desperation has a way of reshaping a person's boundaries. After witnessing the two men casually reinstall cameras inside his home as if they were swapping out batteries in a smoke alarm, he could no longer sit idle, and so the long nights became experiments in interception. He scoured obscure forums, buried himself in tutorials, and ordered strange equipment with cryptic names from suppliers who asked no questions. His house turned into a workshop of tangled wires and blinking lights, and in the oppressive silence of his living room, he rehearsed the process of turning the very surveillance system designed to suffocate him into an unintentional window into the hidden machinery of the association that had declared dominion over his life. It was on the 12th night of this obsessive campaign, with his eyes stinging from the glare of multiple monitors, that the breakthrough came. One of the feeds he had hijacked expected to show the grainy angle of his kitchen ceiling or the monotonous stillness of his hallway. Instead, flickered with images of a starkly lit conference room. The frame was skewed, as if the lens had been placed hurriedly behind a wall vent or light fixture, but the scene was unmistakable. A long table, stacks of folders, and 5 members of the HOA board sitting in a semicircle like judges. He sat upright in his chair, hardly breathing, as he realized that by redirecting the streams, he had accidentally tapped into their own internal meeting space, the very room where decisions were crafted before being wrapped in polite newsletters and mailed to residents. At first, the conversation was banal, filled with numbers about landscaping costs and maintenance fees, the tedious language of neighborhood management that lulled the mind into thinking all of this was harmless bureaucracy. But then one of the men leaned forward, his voice lowering, and the words turned sharp. They spoke of problematic addresses, of compliance-resistant units, their language mechanical, as if the residents were nothing more than inventory in a warehouse. Ryan heard his own name spoken aloud, accompanied by a quiet laugh from Linda Faulkner herself, who remarked that coal will eventually tire out once. The system closes around him. Another board member mentioned installing Stage 2 devices if his resistance continued, and the phrase made Ryan's blood chill even though he had no idea what it entailed. The feed continued for over an hour, each word a hammer striking away at the illusions he had clung to about law and fairness. The board discussed fines they intended to issue retroactively, fabricated violations of lawn maintenance, and strategies to push uncooperative residents into selling their homes at below market value so that partner firms could purchase them cheaply. Ryan recognized several addresses on the list they displayed, neighbors who had quietly moved out in the past year, people he had assumed relocated for personal reasons but who, in reality, had likely been squeezed out by the very machinery now laid bare on his screen, the callousness with which they spoke of families, reducing them to lines of data and targets of pressure, stripped away the last remnants of disbelief. It was not a misunderstanding, not overzealous paperwork, not a single forged signature. It was a system built to dominate. He recorded every second, backing up the files onto external drives, storing duplicates in cloud accounts under names no one could trace to him. His exhaustion evaporated beneath the adrenaline of purpose, and for the first time since discovering the initial camera in his bedroom, he felt something resembling power. Yet the power came with an edge of dread, for he knew that possession of this information placed him in greater danger. If the HOA had gone so far as to break into his house at night, what would they do if they realized he had turned their own network into a mirror reflecting their corruption back at them? The thought kept him restless even as he meticulously documented each new meeting he intercepted over the following days. The true turning point came not from his screens, but from the world outside. On a Saturday morning, when Ryan reluctantly ventured out for groceries, he noticed a group of neighbors gathered in the parking lot near the community gym. Their faces were tense, their voices low, and curiosity drew him closer. One of them, a middle-aged woman he recognized only vaguely from seeing her walk her dog past his house, was holding a letter that looked nearly identical to the forged consent form he had been shown in the HOA office. She was pointing at the signature, her voice trembling with frustration as she insisted it wasn't hers, that she had never signed anything granting permission for residential monitoring. The others exchanged worried glances, several muttering that they too had received strange notices or unexplained fines. It was then that Ryan realized the pattern was not hidden as deeply as he had thought. The cracks in the facade were already beginning to show. He wanted to speak, to tell them what he had seen, but instinct held him back. If he blurted out the truth in that parking lot, it would dissolve into rumor, into hearsay, and Linda and her board would bury it under official letters and bureaucratic language. Instead, he returned home, shut the door, and decided on a different approach. The HOA thrived on secrecy, on the perception that their rules were legitimate and their decisions unquestionable. If he wanted to strike at them, it had to be in a way that shattered the illusion entirely, leaving no space for them to twist or reframe the story. That evening, staring at the glow of his monitors, he formulated the boldest plan he had ever considered. The association had commandeered his house with their cameras, turned his private life into raw footage for their control. Now he would commandeer theirs. He had already tapped into their internal meetings, but it was not enough to sit in silence and accumulate files. He needed to make the community see with their own eyes what was happening behind the polished facade of rules and fines. The people jogging in the mornings, chatting at block parties, watering lawns in quiet compliance. They needed to hear Linda Faulkner dismiss their lives as numbers, to see board members plotting to strip them of homes with the same casual detachment, as moving pawns on a chessboard. Only then would the HOA lose the protective mask it wore so easily. Ryan rehearsed the mechanics in his head, the logistics of interception and redirection. It was not just about recording anymore, but about broadcasting, about turning the hidden channels outward, pushing the concealed rot into the open. If he succeeded, the HOA would no longer be able to hide behind paperwork or notarized forgeries. The neighborhood would know. The community would see. And though the risk clawed at his nerves, though the fear of retaliation gnawed at every corner of his thoughts, he understood that the moment had arrived where survival and resistance were the same thing. The midpoint of his struggle had arrived not with a bang, but with the steady realization that the enemy had revealed itself fully. And now he held in his hands both the weapon of proof and the burden of what to do with it. The days that followed Ryan's decision to turn the hidden feed outward were marked by a strange combination of focus and dread, the kind of heightened awareness that comes when one knows they are walking a tightrope over an abyss. Each step, deliberate and dangerous, each breath a calculation of risk. He had prepared the files, secured the backups, rehearsed the sequence of commands until they were as familiar as the strokes of a keyboard he had pressed 1,000 times before, and yet no amount of preparation could erase the feeling that once he unleashed this, there would be no return to the anonymity that had shielded him, however imperfectly, until now. The HOA could tolerate private dissent, could crush individual complaints with paperwork and signatures, but public exposure was a different kind of war, one that stripped away their cloak of authority and forced them to face a community that would no longer accept their narratives as truth. When the night came, Ryan chose not the comfort of his living room, but the community gym, a place where residents gathered for exercise classes and neighborhood events, a space that, though owned and managed by the HOA, also served as the one location where people congregated naturally and without suspicion. He had studied the building's audiovisual system, noted the inputs and the neglected control panel near the storage closet, and realized that with a few simple connections he could redirect the closed-circuit feed onto the large projector screen that was typically used for movie nights or instructional videos. It was a risk bordering on recklessness, but that was precisely why it would work. No one would expect him to use their own stage as the site of their exposure. On a Thursday evening, when a yoga class was scheduled and dozens of residents filled the gym with rolled mats and casual chatter, Ryan arrived early, his laptop concealed in a nondescript backpack. He moved quietly along the side wall, slipping into the storage closet before anyone noticed, and within minutes he had connected his device to the panel, fingers shaking slightly as he executed the command sequence he had practiced in solitude for weeks. At first, nothing happened and a rush of panic clawed at him. The thought that perhaps the HOA had already altered the encryption or severed the pathway. But then the screen at the front of the room flickered, the soothing music faded, and suddenly the familiar image of the HOA boardroom filled the projector, the board members visible in stark clarity, their voices carrying through the speakers as if they were addressing the very residents they had sought to manipulate. For a long moment the gym was silent, the residents frozen in confusion, and then, as Linda Faulkner's unmistakable voice rang out, discussing the strategy to impose fabricated fines on non-compliant properties and referencing specific addresses, a murmur spread through the crowd. People turned to one another, whispering, then fell silent again as another board member joked about how easy it was to push people out once they start resisting. The casual cruelty of the words, the way they were spoken with laughter rather than shame, struck the room like a physical blow. Ryan, hidden behind the closet door, watched through a crack as faces shifted from bewilderment to outrage, the disbelief slowly burning away to anger as neighbors realized that they were hearing not rumors, not speculation, but the unfiltered truth, spilling directly from the mouths of those who had governed their lives. The broadcast lasted nearly 20 minutes before the screen suddenly cut to black, the projector whirring as the signal was severed. A sharp voice echoed from the back of the gym, and Ryan glimpsed Linda herself standing in the doorway, flanked by two men in security vests, her composure visibly strained for the first time since he had confronted her in the office. She raised her voice to claim the feed was a fabrication, a malicious hack by a disgruntled resident, an attack on the integrity of the association. But the faces of the people in the gym told a different story. They had heard her voice with their own ears, seen her gestures with their own eyes, and no words of denial could erase the recognition that had already settled in their minds. Several shouted questions at her, demanding explanations, and the yoga instructor, usually a woman of gentle calm, folded her arms and asked flatly if Linda intended to accuse them all of hallucinating. Ryan slipped out through the back exit before the confrontation escalated further, his heart hammering but his resolve hardened. He knew the exposure had worked, that the illusion of the HOA's unassailable authority had been punctured in a single evening. Yet he also knew that the retaliation would come swiftly. By the time he reached his house, there was already a notice taped to his front door, printed on the association's heavy cream stationery, accusing him of unauthorized use of community property and threatening legal action for cyber interference. The speed with which they had prepared it suggested they had anticipated his move, perhaps even monitored him more closely than he realized, and the weight of that knowledge pressed heavily against his chest. The retaliation did not stop at paper. The following night he returned home to find his car vandalized, crude words scrawled across the hood in spray paint, the windshield cracked as though by a deliberate blow. On his porch sat a small pile of broken camera parts, fragments of lenses and casings arranged like an offering, a silent message that they knew he had turned the system against them, and that they intended to remind him of who controlled the machinery. He documented everything, photographing the car, the debris, the notice, but beneath the careful documentation lay the gnawing fear that the escalation was no longer about rules and signatures but about intimidation, the kind of pressure designed to erode his will before the final blow of legal action. Even sleep offered no refuge. More than once he woke to the sensation of being watched, only to find no one in the house, though in the distance he occasionally glimpsed figures lingering too long at the end of the street, silhouettes that melted away when he tried to look directly at them. The cameras he had installed of his own were still recording faithfully, yet he understood with bitter clarity that evidence alone would not save him. The HOA operated on a level beyond ordinary complaint. They wielded documents, signatures, and authority in ways that transformed truth into something malleable, a clay shaped to their liking. If they could forge his consent once, they could forge anything, and if they decided to drag him into court, it would be his word against the weight of their bureaucracy. Still, even as fear gnawed at him, he could not suppress the flicker of hope he had seen in the gym, the way neighbors had looked at one another with dawning recognition, the way the murmurs of anger had spread through the crowd. For the first time, it was not just him standing alone against the association's machinery. It was a community beginning to sense that the walls around them had been constructed not for safety, but for control. The second escalation had arrived with the force of inevitability, and though Ryan knew the storm ahead would be brutal, he also understood that the seeds of resistance had been sown in the most unexpected soil. The quiet distrust that once divided. The residence was turning into the shared outrage that might, if nurtured, finally break the hold of those who had treated their lives as nothing more than numbers on a balance sheet. The summons arrived with the precision of a weapon. A thick envelope slid beneath Ryan's door one morning, its official seal pressed like a scar across the cream-colored paper, the kind of document designed to intimidate before it was even opened. Inside were pages of legal accusations. Unauthorized access to private networks, defamation of the association, malicious tampering with community property. Each line read as though crafted to erase his defense before it could be spoken, as if the very act of resisting was a crime punishable by exile. Yet, instead of despair, Ryan felt a strange clarity, because he had known this confrontation was inevitable, and the moment he had seen the faces of his neighbors in the gym, their trust in the HOA breaking like glass, he realized he was no longer simply fighting for himself, but for the proof that what had been done to him had been done to them all. The courtroom was a sterile theater, its beige walls and fluorescent lights draining the air of any comfort, but the weight of the residents who came to watch filled the space with a quiet tension. Ryan sat at the defendant's table, flanked by an attorney who had agreed to represent him after reviewing the footage he carried on hard drives, footage not of his private life, but of the board's own words spilling into their hidden cameras. Across the aisle sat Linda Faulkner and two board members, their postures stiff, their expressions carefully composed, their stack of documents prepared to bury him beneath the appearance of legitimacy. The judge, a middle-aged man with lines etched deep into his forehead from years of listening to petty disputes, regarded the room with weariness. But Ryan knew this was no petty dispute. This was the culmination of months of intrusion, of lies, of intimidation pressed into his very walls. Linda spoke first, her voice smooth, claiming that Ryan had hacked into secure systems, that he had endangered the safety of residents by spreading false information, that the so-called recordings were fabricated composites designed to mislead. She presented the forged consent form again, sliding it across the table with a confidence that suggested she believed the judge would never question the authenticity of a notarized signature. But when Ryan's attorney rose, she did not begin with his case. Instead, she called forward a neighbor, the woman Ryan had seen in the parking lot weeks earlier, clutching her own letter. The woman held it up and explained that the signature at the bottom was not hers, that she had never signed anything authorizing surveillance, and she spoke with a tremor in her voice that gradually steadied as she saw the judge lean closer to examine it. Then another resident came forward, and another, each one holding papers eerily similar, each one insisting the signatures were forgeries, until the courtroom filled with the low murmur of disbelief. Ryan felt his chest tighten with something like relief as he watched the weight shift, the board's mask beginning to crack. When his turn came, his attorney plugged a drive into the court's projector and played the recordings. The grainy footage from the hidden feed showing Linda and her colleagues laughing about pushing people out and discussing staged violations. Their voices, unguarded and confident, filled the courtroom, and the silence that followed was heavier than any outburst. The judge leaned back, eyes narrowing, and asked Linda directly if she wished to deny that the voice on the tape was hers. For the first time, her composure faltered, her answer stumbling, her smile tightening into something brittle. The board attempted to argue about legality, about context, about procedure, but the tide had already turned. The residents seated behind Ryan shifted forward, their presence a reminder that this was not the grievance of one man but of an entire community misled and exploited. The judge finally raised a hand, silencing the arguments, and announced that the evidence presented was sufficient to suspend the authority of the HOA pending further investigation. He ruled that all surveillance equipment was to be removed immediately, that the contracts and signatures would be subjected to forensic review, and that any retaliatory action against residents during this process would result in criminal charges. His voice carried the authority the HOA had long pretended to wield, and for the first time Ryan felt the balance of power tilt away from them. As the gavel struck, the courtroom erupted, not in cheers but in a stunned quiet, the kind of silence that follows the breaking of a long and suffocating spell. Ryan remained seated, his body heavy with exhaustion, but inside him burned the recognition that the battle had reached its climax and that the association's grip had been loosened, not by his solitude, but by the collective weight of truth, finally exposed. When the court session ended and the residents began to file out, Ryan remained seated for a long while, his hands resting on the table as if he were anchoring himself to the reality that the storm had finally broken. Outside, the afternoon sun spilled across the courthouse steps, and for the first time in months he felt the warmth not as a distant light but as something that touched him directly, unobstructed by suspicion or fear. Neighbors he had barely spoken to before approached him quietly, some offering brief words of thanks, others simply nodding with an unspoken acknowledgement that he had done what none of them had dared to attempt. Their presence reminded him that he had not been as alone as he believed, that silence had not meant indifference but only fear, and now that fear had cracked. Back at his house, the atmosphere was different, though the walls and windows remained unchanged. Workers, appointed by the temporary administrator, moved systematically through the neighborhood dismantling the surveillance equipment, their ladders leaning against walls, their toolboxes rattling as each device was removed and bagged as evidence. Ryan watched from his porch as a man carried out the last hidden lens from his kitchen, sealing it into a plastic container, and the relief that followed was so profound it felt like the house itself exhaled. For weeks he had lived under the invisible weight of eyes, each shadow a suspicion, each creak a warning, but now the silence of the rooms felt like genuine quiet rather than the pause before intrusion. He did not celebrate with fanfare or parties, but one evening, when the sky burned orange and the street was empty, he opened his bedroom curtains fully for the first time since that night he had spotted the red glimmer. He sat by the window, letting the fading light spill across the floorboards, and allowed himself the rare sensation of peace. On the table beside him he had placed one of the cameras, the small metallic shell mounted in a frame, not as a trophy but as a reminder of what had been done and what had been overcome. It stood as both warning and testament, a fragment of the system that had invaded his sanctuary and the proof that it could be dismantled. The HOA would be rebuilt under new oversight, the investigation would continue, and the people who had turned their community into a theater of control would face accountability. Ryan knew that the struggle had changed him, that he would never again move through his home with the casual innocence he once carried, but he also understood that resilience was not only survival, but transformation. The neighborhood no longer looked the same, not because the houses had changed, but because the people within them had seen what lay beneath the surface, and once seen, it could not be unseen. And as he finally closed his eyes that night, the darkness felt like his own again, unobserved, unclaimed, the simple quiet of a man who had defended the walls of his life and won them back.